Hello, welcome to the 11th of the Introduction to Linguistics seminars. Second time we're looking at syntax. And this time we're going to be looking not just at structure, but also how we know that the structures that we are proposing are the right ones. And we'll be looking at ways of testing for syntactic structures then. Let's first remind ourselves what we said about syntactic structures. We've said that a sentence is made up of at least two parts. One of those parts, the first one, functions as the subject of the sentence, and the other one is the predicate. Now, typically, the subject comes out as being some sort of like a nominal phrase, and the predicate is a verb phrase. Now, we know that the verb phrase and the subject nominal phrase can be more complicated, and in fact one thing that you can get inside a verb phrase is another nominal phrase. Now, we distinguish that nominal phrase from the one that comes up directly underneath the sentence by calling it something else. We call this the object. So basically, a subject is a nominal phrase which comes directly inside the sentence. It's the first element in the sentence, whereas the object is the nominal phrase inside the verb phrase and which follows the verb. Okay, so we basically have a structure then of a sentence that looks like this, and we can populate those positions there with words of the relevant categories. So inside a nominal phrase we can have a noun like John, and inside a verb phrase we can have a verb like loves, and inside the object nominal phrase we can have another noun like Mary. Okay, so we predict something like John loves Mary is a grammatical sentence in English, which of course it is. But if you have a look at that sentence just by itself, you see three words, John loves Mary, and the question is, how do we know that it's structured in the way that we've just said? That is, how do we know that the verb and the object go together to form a verb phrase, and that the subject is separate from that verb phrase, going together with it to form a sentence? Why wouldn't we want to think that it's the other way round? That is, that the subject and the verb go together to form a verb phrase, and it's the object which is separate, which goes together with the verb phrase to form the sentence. Just looking at the sentence, John loves Mary, it's very difficult to see why we would want to choose one of these structures over the other. It's not obvious that loves and Mary goes together at all. What we see here is just three words. You don't actually see the structure, so it's hard to know that that's the way things are organized in a sentence. However, there are ways of determining what the correct structure is, and we'll see that the one we've proposed so far does seem to bear the weight of evidence in its favour. There are a number of different ways of arguing for it, both from a theoretical point of view and also from empirical points of views. We'll look at these individually and separately. First of all, let's take a theoretical line of argument. This is based on the fact that inside the verb phrase we often find verbs followed by different types of phrases, all depending on which verbs we use. So if we have a look at a number of sentences like John slept, or John met Mary, John spoke to Mary, John said Mary is nice. Note, with these different verbs, sleep, meet, speak and say, we have different elements following those verbs. Okay, with sleep we don't get anything necessarily to follow that verb at all. With meet we can have a nominal phrase, we can have an object. With speak we have a prepositional phrase to Mary, and with say we get another sentence following the verb there. Mary is nice is obviously a sentence in itself. So different verbs seem to be followed by different elements inside this verb phrase. And in fact, it turns out that this is restricted. You can't just follow any verb with any kind of element. So, for example, the verb sleep can't be followed by a sentence. You can't say John slept, Mary is nice. The verb meet can't be followed by nothing. So you can't just say John met. Speak can't be followed by a nominal phrase and have an object. So you can't say John spoke Mary. And the verb say can't have a prepositional phrase following it. So John said to Mary. So clearly then there are restrictions on what verbs can go with what things, kinds of phrases that follow them. And obviously this is also, it's a lexical property of those verbs, because it all depends on which verb we're looking at as to which kinds of phrases can and can't follow the verb. What we say here is that we say that the verb selects for its complementation. The phrases that follow the verbs are known as the complements of the verb, and together that whole lot is the complementation of verbs. And verbs, individual verbs, select for which elements are going to be able to appear in their complement positions. Now, traditionally, we have separate names for such verbs which select for different complements. So traditionally, a verb like sleep, which doesn't have a complement at all, is called an intransitive verb. Meet, on the other hand, which, as we've seen, has an object, a nominal phrase complement, is called a transitive verb. Speak, which has a prepositional phrase complement, is often called a prepositional verb. And say, which has a clause as its complement, is often called a propositional verb. Now, as I've said, this is all to do with the lexical properties of those verbs. So this kind of information, along with all the other kinds of information that we need to know about words, is going to have to be stored in the lexical entries of these verbs. So we're going to need to know how to pronounce a word like sleep. We're going to need to know what it means, what its syntactic category is, i.e. it's a verb, and also what its complements can be. And here we've got that indicated by this null symbol saying that sleep doesn't have a complement. Meet, on the other hand, is pronounced meet. It means whatever meet means. It's a verb, and its complement is a noun phrase. Speak, etc., etc., has a complement, which is a prepositional phrase, and say has a complement, which is a sentence. Okay. Now, all this goes together to support the idea that there is a close connection between the verb and its complement. That is, the verb and the complement seem to form some sort of semantic unit, which the verb and the subject don't. There's no selectional restrictions placed on verbs and subjects. Subjects seem to be more separate from the rest of the thing, which is exactly what our structure that we proposed says. It says the subject is separate from the verb phrase, and the verb phrase is made up of the verb plus whatever phrase that follows it, i.e. its complement. So on those kind of theoretical observations, then, we can support this analysis of the sentence where the verb phrase follows the subject and is made up of the verb plus whatever follows the verb. Let's look at some empirical reasons why we want to consider the verb phrase to be made up of the verb plus whatever follows it. Well, we know that there must be rules in the grammar that tells us how to put things into sentences, how to combine words and into phrases and then into sentences. So basically the syntactic rules determine the positions inside a sentence of the constituents of that sentence, the constituents being the parts that it breaks up into, including words and phrases, and also other sentences in subordinate sentences which we find inside another sentence. So those are all the constituents of the sentence, and obviously the syntactic rules determine where each of those constituents go. So for example, we might have a sentence broken up into two phrases, an X kind of phrase and a Y kind of phrase, and the next kind of phrase can be made up of a word like a word 1 and a word 2, and a Y phrase can be made up of a word 3. The rules might also tell us that Y phrases can be more complicated, and we can also have other kinds of things like, for example, other phrases, maybe of the kind of an X phrase. Now we already know that an X phrase can have a word 1 and a word 2 in it, and so this would be the kind of sentence that the grammar might produce. Okay, but note, we now see that inside this sentence there are a number of places where we can find an X phrase. Okay, we can find it directly underneath the sentence, and we can also find it inside a Y phrase. These are the possible positions that we can find this kind of phrase. And the possible positions that we find phrases, we call it their distribution, just like we've seen in phonology, that phonemes, or phones in particular, have distributions, the context in which they can appear. Well, so do constituents of a sentence, precisely because the rules of of syntax tell us what positions these constituents go in. Okay, so constituents then have distributions. Okay, and we can also see that the same is not going to be true of things which are not constituents. So, for example, take word 2 and word 4 in this structure here. Those two words don't go together to form any kind of distribution. Therefore, there is no syntactic rule which tells us where to put word 2 and word 4 together as a unit. Okay, there's just simply no rule that does that, and therefore we wouldn't expect to find any distributional pattern of those words going together in other sentences. They just simply won't have a distribution. Now, we can take that kind of observation and we can turn it on its head and actually make use of it to determine what the actual structure of a sentence that the syntactic rules determine to be, by just simply saying that if something has a distribution, then it must be a constituent. So if you can observe that some element or some phrase or some group of words has a distribution across various sentences, then we can determine that that group of words must be a phrase, a constituent. Okay, let's sort of see how that works. Take these sentences here. Clearly the boy with the cheese sandwich has come prepared. I saw the boy with the cheese sandwich enter the building, and no one spoke to the boy with the cheese sandwich. Note, in these sentences, we've got this group of words appearing in a number of different positions. The boy with the cheese sandwich appears in all three sentences, but not in the same place. Therefore, we can see that this group of words has a distribution, and observing that, we can assume, therefore, that that group of words is a phrase. And of course, that's a nominal phrase, the kind of thing that can sit in the subject position, as in the first case, the object position, as in the second, and inside a prepositional phrase, as in the third. Okay, compare that to another group of words which we can find in one of those sentences, like sandwich enter the. Okay, now, I think it's fairly obvious that that isn't going to form a constituent, and lo and behold, you can't find that group of words in any other position anywhere else in any other sentence. So clearly sandwich enter the has come prepared is just ungrammatical. Similarly, no one spoke to sandwich enter the. Okay, so clearly then this thing is not a constituent, it doesn't have distribution. So we can see how we can use distributional facts in order to argue for what is and what isn't a constituent inside a structure, and therefore learn more about what the structure of any particular phrase or sentence is. However, that said, we have to admit that this particular test itself is limited to some degree, inasmuch as it's very good for identifying certain phrases, but not necessarily for others, for the simple reason that some phrases do tend to have quite varied distributions. For example, we've already seen that noun phrases have quite varied distributions. We can find them in subject position, in object position, or inside prepositions, inside prepositional phrases, and various other places elsewhere. So NPs, you can find them in a lot of different places, and therefore you can quite easily see that they have a distribution. Preposition phrases also do come in various positions, and again you can see that something is a preposition phrase by looking at its distribution. However, the verb phrase, and that's what we're mostly going to be interested in this session, because we're trying to work out how we know that the verb phrase is made up of the verb plus whatever else that follows it. The verb phrase is more limited. In fact, you only ever get one verb phrase per any sentence. And furthermore, it tends to go in exactly the same position in every sentence. So its distribution is not as varied, and therefore it's more difficult to show that we've got a verb phrase made up of a verb plus something that follows it in terms of distributional arguments. However, there are other kinds of tests which are also related to distribution but are perhaps more successful at finding verb phrases. One of these is called the replacement test. The replacement test is basically works in the same principles as a distribution test, because what it's saying is that certain phrases, because they have the same distribution, are therefore going to have the same category. Okay, because the grammar determines that certain positions are the kinds of places where certain groups of words of the same category can go. They'll say this here is an NP position, or this is a prepositional phrase position, or this is a verb phrase position. So if two things have the same category, they have the same distribution, and if you turn it the other way around, if two things have the same distribution, then they have the same category. And, of course, therefore, only constituents are going to have categories. Okay, the grammar isn't going to give a category to something that it doesn't recognize as being part of the sentence. Two words that just happen to be next to each other in a particular sentence is not going to have a category. Only constituents have categories, and therefore we can look to see what we can do with the sentence, and if we can replace one thing for another, therefore those two things have the same distributions, therefore they have the same categories, therefore they must be constituents. Okay, so if you can replace one thing for another, those things must be constituents. Let's have a look and see how that would work. Let's take our sentence, John loves Mary. Now we can have another sentence, John sneezed. Both sentences are perfectly good, but as you can see, what we've done is we've taken loves Mary and we've replaced it with something else, sneeze. Just a single verb here. That is, these two things have the same distribution because they have the same category. Loves Mary is a VP, and an intransitive verb all by itself can be a VP. Note, the same doesn't happen for the verb plus the subject. You can't replace the verb and the subject for a single word, say a verb. You can't say sneezed Mary as a good grammatical sentence, where what we're trying to do here is replace John loves with something. Simply put, you can't replace the subject plus the verb with anything, and therefore that would all go to support our assumption that it's the verb phrase, the verb plus whatever it is that follows it, the object in this particular case, that forms a unit and not the subject plus the verb. Then we have a pronominalization test. This, again, is very much related to the replacement test, because what we're doing with this test is replacing certain parts or certain constituents in a sentence with particular elements. These things go by the name of pronouns, and pronouns are often used to replace phrases, but This is more informative than just simply replacing one constituent with another, because generally speaking, a pronoun can be given the same kind of meaning that the thing that we replace it with has. So, for example, let's take a sentence like the judge met the lawyer in the park. Now, if she refers to the judge and him refers to the lawyer and there refers to in the park, then she met him there means exactly the same thing as the judge met the lawyer in the park. And we see that we've replaced the judge with the pronoun she, the lawyer with the pronoun him, and in the park with, again, a kind of a pronoun, but this is more like a pro-preposition phrase. It stands for the preposition phrase there. And we'll find that other kinds of constituents also can be pronominalized in this way, though not using what have traditionally been recognized as a pronoun. Take, for example, this is an important point, obviously, in the argument that if you can replace something with a pronoun, that something must be a constituent, because the pronoun has the same distribution as the thing you're replacing with it, and it's only constituents that have distributions, as we've seen. So let's take some sentences. John loves Mary and Bill does too. That does too there, what's that? Well, it seems to be replacing and referring to the same thing as loves Mary does, because the sentence means John loves Mary and Bill loves Mary. Okay, so we could claim that does too is a VP pronoun. Okay, and what it's replacing here is, of course, the verb plus the following object, which again goes to support the claim that the verb phrase is made up of the verb plus whatever follows it, not the verb plus the subject preceding it. That in itself can be shown by the fact that you can't do the same thing with the verb plus the subject. You can't replace that with some sort of pronoun-like element and get something like John loves Mary and does too Bill, meaning that John loves Bill as well as Mary. Okay, clearly that doesn't work. So then we've got an argument against the structure that says the subject and the verb go together to form the verb phrase, because clearly you can't pronominalize the subject plus the verb. Another kind of test, again related to distribution, but this time to do with how we can rearrange sentences for certain semantic and perhaps stylistic purposes. For example, take a sentence like the judge met those lawyers in the park. You can move or rearrange the object, those lawyers, and put it actually in front of the subject of the whole sentence to form a kind of a special kind of sentence in which we are laying a certain amount of emphasis on the object here. So we can say those lawyers the judge met in the park. Okay. Now, you can do this not freely in English, and some languages allow such rearrangements more than English does, but the fact that you can do it seems to suggest something about the way sentences are structured, because note, it's not just any kinds of things that you can rearrange like this. You wouldn't be able to take, say, for example, the words those lawyers in, okay, put it somewhere else in the sentence and get those lawyers in the judge met the park. Clearly that doesn't work. So again, it's only a restricted amount of things that can be rearranged or displaced, and it turns out it's only constituents, things that are actual phrases or parts of a sentence, which can undergo this kind of rearrangement. And therefore, again, we can take that observation, turn it on its head, and use it as a way of finding out what the constituents of a sentence are, because if something can be displaced, then it must be a constituent. Okay, and turns out that we can use this to determine what the verb phrase is too. So let's take a sentence like, I thought John might love Mary, and obviously he obviously does love Mary. Okay, now that's rather a boring sentence because what we've got is a bit of a repetition there. He loves Mary and John might love Mary. It's a bit repetitive. So what we can do to avoid the repetition here is take hold of that love Mary and move it to the front of that other sentence, the second sentence there. So I thought John might love Mary, and love Mary he obviously does. Okay. Note what's been displaced here is love Mary, which we have been claiming forms a verb phrase. That is a constituent precisely because it can be displaced. Another test is to do with what we can leave out of sentences. We can often leave parts of sentences out or delete them to avoid repetition of the kind of thing that we've seen just now. So, for example, take a sentence, John bought beer, but Bill didn't buy beer. Okay, you got bought beer there twice, it's a bit repetitive. But one thing you could do is just simply miss out that repeated phrase. So, John bought beer, but Bill didn't, is fine. Now, this kind of deletion or leaving out of a sentence is more restricted than most other phenomena, in as much as you can't just miss anything out here. In particular, you can miss out the verb phrase, buy beer, but not parts of the verb phrase. So, for example, you couldn't miss out, say, the verb and say, John bought beer, but Bill didn't beer. Okay, that's not going to work. Or you can't miss out the object, but keep the verb and say, John bought beer, but Bill didn't buy. Okay, it's got to be the whole verb phrase that you miss out here. Therefore, if that's true, and you can miss it out, then it must be a verb phrase. And again, that's going to support our analysis, because what you can miss out here is the verb plus what follows it, the object, which shows us that the verb plus the object forms a verb phrase. Finally then, one last test is to do with a kind of a mechanism we have in language of taking two or more elements and putting them together to form one single thing. It's called coordination, and it makes use of words like and or but. Okay, so for example, you can take two words like run and hide, and you can put those together, and what you do by putting them together in a coordination is to form a single verb, or at least something that behaves like a single verb. So wherever you could have the verb run, you could also have run and hide. Okay, it's not just verbs that it works with, but also any kind of word. You can take any two words of the same category and coordinate them. And here we've got two coordinated nouns, the doctors and lawyers. Here we're coordinating doctors and lawyers as part of a noun phrase, the doctors and lawyers. It's not just words you can do it with, but you can do it with whole phrases too. So these doctors and those lawyers, two nominal phrases being conjoined. Okay, now obviously if you can conjoin something, then it's going to be a phrase of some sort. So let's have a look. And can you conjoin two strings of words involving say for example doctor treated Mary in the sentence, this doctor treated Mary? Well, obviously you're not going to be able to conjoin those two things because simply they're not phrases. Doctor treated Mary is part of the subject plus what we're calling the verb phrase. It's not a constituent in itself, and therefore we wouldn't expect it to be able to be coordinated. So it's only constituents that can be coordinated. The fact then that you can coordinate love Mary with something shows us that that thing is a constituent, and again it will support our analysis that the sentence is made up of a subject plus a verb phrase, and the verb phrase is made up of the verb plus a phrase that follows it, depending on which verb it is. Okay, so let's briefly summarise what we've said today. We've been looking at tests for constituent structure, using observations about the way certain phenomena work in language, and these work as tests because basically these phenomena are dependent on the structures that they reveal. So if you look at how these things work, you can work out what is and what isn't a constituent inside a sentence. The kinds of tests we've looked at have been varied, different sorts, some of them to do with distribution, others not so much. We've seen the distribution test itself, a replacement test where you replace one part of the constituent for something else. Pronominalization test, very similar to that, only we use specific things to replace parts of structures with, that is pronoun, proform elements. Displacement test works on the idea that certain things can get moved around in a sentence, but it's only constituents that can do that. Deletion tests, more specifically for the verb phrase, that was a particularly useful one to show that the verb phrase consists of the verb plus the thing that follows it, because it's only those things that can undergo this kind of deletion, leaving part of the sentence out in order to avoid repetition. And finally, the coordination test, where we can coordinate two different elements, make them into one thing, but it can only be constituents that can do that. All of the tests that we've looked at then have come to the conclusion that the sentence is structured in such a way that the subject goes together with a following verb phrase, and that verb phrase is made up of a verb plus whatever phrase that particular verb requires as its complement. Okay, that's enough. I'll see you in class. Bye.